Ruth in a deep, peaceful sleep in the dark, quiet room with her fiancé James. It was their first night together in his home, a moment she had dreamed of for weeks. But in the quietness of the night, something evil was stirring. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. Suddenly, a massive, terrifying figure appeared out of the darkness. The creature was horrifying to behold. It was huge, taller than any man, with skin that looked cracked and rough. Its eyes glowed like burning coals, and its mouth twisted into a cruel grin, exposing rows of jagged teeth. It has a very long, dark pubic hair that goes down its legs, nearly touching the floor, and between its legs is a manhood so big and huge it seemed monstrous. Ruth's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling as though she sensed its presence, even in her sleep. The creature crept toward her bed, its heavy footsteps making no sound. Its shadow covered her small body. It stood over her for a moment before getting onto the bed. She felt it immediately, a weight pressing down on her, something invading her dreams and dragging her into a horrifying, half-conscious state. Ruth wanted to scream, to push it away, but her body wouldn't obey. Her arms and legs were frozen, her voice silenced, as though an invisible hand had gripped her throat. The creature began to make love to her, its touch overwhelming. Somewhere deep inside, Ruth knew this was wrong, knew she should resist, but there was a part of her, a dark, forbidden part, that enjoyed the sensation. It was a pleasure like nothing she had ever known, but it came with a suffocating, unnatural power that terrified her. She was moaning even though tears streamed down her cheeks as she battled the war inside her mind, wanting to escape but feeling utterly trapped. Suddenly, Ruth's eyes snapped open and she let out a terrifying scream that echoed through the room. James, startled awake, jumped out of bed in panic, his heart racing. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice shaking. He looked at Ruth, who was sitting upright, her body trembling, her face drenched in sweat. Her eyes darted around the room, wide with fear. "He was here," she gasped, clutching the bedsheet to her chest. "Who? What are you talking about?" James asked. Confusion and concern etched on his face. Ruth's voice was barely above a whisper. "The monster. He was here." James frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "What monster? Ruth, what are you talking about?" She pointed toward the shadows in the corner of the room, her hands shaking violently. "He came to me. He." Her voice trailed off as her gaze fell to the bed. James followed her eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Ruth's panties were pulled down to her knees, and the sheets beneath her were soaked wet. The dampness wasn't just sweat, it was something else entirely. James's heart pounded in his chest as dread crept over him. What is this?" he stammered, stepping away from the bed. Ruth tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It's not what you think. He comes to me in my dreams. I don't know how to stop him. I've tried, James. I've tried, but I can't." James cut her off, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "You mean to tell me some monster is doing this to you? And you can't stop it?" Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, James, I didn't choose this. I don't want this. I can't do this," James interrupted, running his hands through his hair. "I can't be with someone who's haunted by something like this. This is too much. You need help, Ruth, but I can't help you." Ruth's heart shattered. "No, James, please, don't leave me. We can figure this out together. I'll find a way to stop him. Please, just don't leave me." But James shook his head, his face pale and his voice firm. I can't compete with that. I'm sorry, Ruth. You need to go." Ruth sobbed as she gathered her belongings. She turned back to James one last time, hoping he would change his mind, but he wouldn't even look at her. As she stepped out into the cold night air, Ruth felt an overwhelming wave of despair. The streets were empty, silent except for the sound of her own footsteps. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing. "I have to stop him," she whispered to herself. "I can't let him control my life anymore. I don't care how much I enjoy it. I need my freedom." But deep down, she knew the monster wasn't just in her dreams. It was inside her, a dark presence she had yet to fully understand. The thought sent chills down her spine as she walked into the darkness, determined to fight back, but unsure if she could ever win. Ruth rushed home, her face streaked with tears, her heart heavy with pain. She burst through the door and ran straight to her grandmother, collapsing at her feet. "Grandma, it's happened again," she cried, her voice shaking, tears pouring down her cheeks. Her grandmother, an elderly woman with kind yet tired eyes, sighed deeply. She pulled Ruth close, gently stroking her hair. "Oh, my child," she whispered. "I told you, no man can marry you. It's not your fault, Ruth. This curse is older than you, older than any of us." Ruth looked up, her tear-filled eyes begging for answers. "Why, Grandma? Why does this keep happening to me?" Her grandmother's face grew somber as she prepared to reveal a truth she had kept hidden for years. "It started long before you were born, Ruth," she began. Her voice trembled as she continued. "Your parents, they were desperate for a child. For 13 years of marriage, they prayed, they cried, but no baby came. People mocked them, Ruth. They called them cursed. Your mother couldn't bear the shame anymore." Ruth listened intently, her sobs quieting as the weight of her grandmother's words hung in the air. "One day," her grandmother continued, "your mother's friend told her about the goddess of the river, a powerful being who could grant her a child. Desperate and broken, your mother went to her. The goddess agreed to help, but there was a terrible price to pay." Ruth's heart pounded. "What price, Grandma?" Her grandmother hesitated, tears glistening in her own eyes. "The goddess told your mother she could have a child, but she would have to give one of her children back as a sacrifice. Ruth, your mother agreed. She was so desperate, she didn't think of the future, of what it would mean for you. When you were born, you were promised to the goddess. You don't belong to this world, my child. You belong to the gods." Ruth's hands trembled as she bowed her head, tears streaming down her face like a waterfall. The pain of betrayal, the weight of the curse, it was too much to bear. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "Why me, Grandma? Why did she choose me?" Her grandmother had no answers, only sorrow. Ruth stood abruptly, her fists clenched. Her face was a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Ruth, where are you going?" her grandmother called, panic in her voice. But Ruth didn't stop. She stormed out of the house, her tears blurring her vision. She walked with purpose, her steps heavy and determined, until she reached the graveyard. Her mother's grave lay there, silent and unyielding. Ruth knelt down in front of the grave, her body trembling with rage and sorrow. "Why, Mother?" she cried out, her voice breaking. "Why me? Why did you do this to me?" She placed her hands on the cold stone, her tears falling onto the ground below. "Was I not enough for you to love? Did you not think of what this would do to me?" Ruth lay down on the grave, clutching at the earth as if trying to feel her mother's presence. Her cries echoed through the empty graveyard, raw and unrestrained. "You cursed me, Mother. You gave me away to the gods. How could you do this? How could you leave me like this?" The wind grew stronger, whipping her hair around her face, as if nature itself shared her fury. Ruth's voice grew quieter, her energy drained by her grief. "I don't want to belong to the gods. I want to belong to myself. I want to be free." She stayed there for hours, the weight of her sorrow pinning her to the ground. The night fell, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, but Ruth didn't move. Her heart was heavy, her soul consumed by the pain of betrayal and the desire for answers. Finally, as the moon rose high, Ruth whispered, "I will break this curse, no matter what it takes. I will fight the gods themselves if I have to." With those words, a new determination sparked in her heart. Ruth wiped her tears and stood. She turned and walked away from the grave, her shadow stretching long behind her in the moonlight. She didn't know where the road would lead, but she knew one thing. She would not let the curse define her. She would find a way to reclaim her life, no matter the cost. Ruth had shut herself away from the world. She avoided everyone, especially men who showed interest in her or talked about marriage. The fear of the strange and terrifying incidents happening again haunted her. She didn't want to bring shame or danger to anyone else. Months passed, and her grandmother, noticing how lonely and withdrawn Ruth had become, decided to intervene. One day, she called Ruth to her. "Ruth, my child, how long will you continue living like this?" Her grandmother asked gently, her voice filled with concern. "You cannot spend your whole life hiding. We need to find a solution to this problem." At first, Ruth hesitated, but her grandmother's persistence gave her a glimmer of hope. Finally, Ruth agreed. The next day, Ruth arrived at her grandmother's house, her heart pounding with nervousness. Together, they began the long journey to a powerful native doctor who was said to have the wisdom to help people break curses and escape spiritual bonds. The road to the shrine was eerie. The forest path they followed was quiet, with only the sound of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Ruth's stomach churned as they walked, her mind racing with questions. Would this really work? Could she finally be free? When they arrived at the shrine, the air felt heavy, as though the spirits themselves were watching. The native doctor, an old man with deep wrinkles and piercing eyes, sat cross-legged on a mat surrounded by strange objects, bones, feathers, and pots of unknown substances. Ruth and her grandmother knelt before him, and her grandmother explained everything. Ruth's spiritual husband, the strange visits, the dreams, and the curse that bound her. The native doctor listened silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "This is not an ordinary problem," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "The one who holds Ruth's bond is powerful. The only way to break this curse is for Ruth to go directly to the priest of the shrine where she was devoted as a child. He is the only one who has the knowledge to free her from this spirit." Ruth felt her heart skip a beat. The idea of going to the shrine where it all began terrified her, but the native doctor's words gave her a sliver of hope. "If I go there," she asked hesitantly, "can I really be free?" The native doctor nodded. "Yes, but you must be ready to face the spirit and endure whatever trials may come. Breaking such a bond will not be easy." Ruth's grandmother thanked the native doctor, and they began their journey home. As they walked, Ruth felt a mix of emotions: fear, hope, and something darker. Deep down, she couldn't stop thinking about her spiritual husband. He had always been a mix of terror and pleasure in her life. She remembered the overwhelming intimacy, the feeling of being consumed by something so powerful and otherworldly. His touch was unlike anything she had ever known, and his presence left her shaken yet yearning. But Ruth shook her head, trying to banish those thoughts. "No," she told herself firmly. "I can't live like this anymore. I deserve to be free, to live my own life, even if it means giving up the strange pleasures of the spirit world." As they reached her grandmother's house, Ruth paused at the door. "Grandma," she said quietly, "I'll do it. I'll go to the shrine. I want my freedom." Her grandmother took her hands and gave her a reassuring smile. "You are strong, Ruth. I know you can do this. No spirit is stronger than your will to live a free and happy life." That night, Ruth lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her heart was heavy, her thoughts swirling. The idea of confronting the spirit terrified her, but she knew she couldn't let fear hold her back. "I will fight for my life," she whispered to herself, "even if it means facing the gods themselves." The day finally arrived for Ruth to visit the shrine where she had been unknowingly devoted as a child. Her heart was heavy with fear and uncertainty, but her grandmother held her hand firmly, offering words of encouragement. "This journey will not be easy, my child, but I believe it will be worth it," her grandmother said gently. They set out at dawn, traveling to a faraway village deep in the forest. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around them as they walked. Strange sounds echoed through the forest: rustling leaves, distant animal cries, and the occasional snap of a branch. Ruth clutched her grandmother's hand tightly, her fear growing with every step. When they finally arrived, the shrine stood before them, shadowy and foreboding. It was built from dark stones, with carvings of fearsome faces etched into its walls. The air around it felt heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Smoke from burning incense curled into the sky, and strange markings covered the ground. Ruth shivered as a warm chill ran down her spine. It was the same strange, unsettling feeling she experienced every night when her spiritual husband came to her. Part of her felt a twisted sense of comfort, but another part of her wanted to run far, far away. They stood outside the shrine, unsure of what to do next. The forest was eerily silent, and no one appeared to greet them. Just as Ruth opened her mouth to speak to her grandmother, a deep, echoing voice came from the shadows. "Welcome," it said, calm yet chilling. Ruth's heart jumped, and she gripped her grandmother's arm tightly. They turned toward the sound and saw a man step out from the darkness. He was strikingly handsome, with skin as smooth as polished wood and sharp, captivating eyes that seemed to pierce through Ruth's soul. His tall frame was draped in traditional attire, a crimson robe adorned with intricate patterns and beads hung around his neck. His voice was deep, commanding, yet oddly soothing. "Please come in," he said, gesturing toward the shrine. Ruth and her grandmother hesitated before removing their footwear, as was customary, and stepping inside. The shrine was dimly lit by flickering flames from oil lamps, casting long shadows on the walls. Strange objects hung from the ceiling: feathers, bones, and charms, and the air was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. They sat down on woven mats, their bodies stiff with fear. 2 minutes passed in silence before the man spoke again. "Welcome home," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Ruth's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The words "home" sent a chill through her, and she instinctively turned to face the man. For a moment, she was taken aback by his appearance. How can someone so handsome be part of something so terrifying? She thought, her mind swirling with confusion and unease. The man sat down gracefully, his movements deliberate. Before Ruth or her grandmother could explain, he raised a hand. "There's no need to speak. We've been expecting you," he said, his gaze fixed on Ruth. Hearing this, Ruth felt her knees weaken, and she fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She knelt before him, her voice trembling. "Please," she begged, "help me. I want to be free. I just want to live a normal life like other girls. I don't want this anymore." The man sighed deeply, his expression unreadable. "Freedom is possible," he said after a pause, "but it comes with a price. You must be willing to undergo a 7-day cleansing ritual. Only then can the divorce ceremony be performed, and you will be set free to live the life you desire." Ruth wiped her tears and looked up at him, hope flickering in her heart. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. "I'll do anything. I just want to be free." Her grandmother leaned forward. "What does the ritual require?" she asked cautiously. The man's expression darkened slightly. "During the 7 days, Ruth must return here each night and sleep with the chief priest as part of the cleansing process. Once the 7 days are complete, the final divorce ritual will be revealed." Ruth's face turned pale, her heart sinking into her stomach. "What?" she said, her voice cracking with disbelief. She stood abruptly, her hands shaking. "I will never do that. Never." Her grandmother quickly reached for her hand, trying to calm her down. "Ruth, think about this. This might be the only way." "No," Ruth shouted, pulling away. Tears welled up in her eyes as anger and shame burned in her chest. "I can't do it, Grandma. I won't." The handsome man sat silently, watching her with an unreadable expression. Ruth stormed out of the shrine, her grandmother following close behind. As they walked back through the dark forest, Ruth's mind raced. She felt betrayed, cornered, and hopeless. The thought of submitting to the ritual made her stomach churn, but the fear of never escaping her spiritual husband was just as unbearable. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered to herself, "Why me? Why does my freedom have to come at such a cost?" Ruth came home that evening, her heart heavy with frustration. Her thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind, and tears rolled down her cheeks like rivers. She flung herself onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow. "What should I do?" she whispered to the empty room. Before she knew it, sleep claimed her. The air in the room grew heavy, and a strange chill settled over her. Then, as always, he came, the shadowy figure, her spirit husband. He wasn't like a man she could see clearly, but she could feel him, his presence wrapping around her. She didn't resist. Instead, her body betrayed her. She moaned and writhed, trapped between fear and forbidden pleasure. When Ruth suddenly woke, her eyes shot open. Her heart raced as she realized the mess she had made, her sheets soaked, her body trembling. Shame and frustration flooded her. "I can't keep living like this," she cried. "I need to end this curse, no matter what it takes." She remembered the native doctor she had visited. His piercing gaze and calm voice replayed in her mind. Despite her fear of rituals, she thought, he did seem trustworthy and quite handsome. That morning, Ruth decided, this has to end, today. The native doctor had given Ruth strict instructions. "Come alone, follow the path into the forest. You'll find a shrine. Be ready for whatever you face." Ruth packed her things nervously, her hands shaking. The forest path was narrow. Shadows stretched long across the dirt trail as the sun began to set, her heart pounding louder with each step. Finally, she arrived at the shrine. Just as she was about to call out, a deep, disembodied voice echoed around her. "Take the path to your right. Walk until you find the hut. Enter and wait." Ruth's legs trembled as she obeyed. The hut was small and dark, its only furnishings a mat and a flickering oil lamp. She sat in silence, her mind racing with questions. Was this the right choice? Would this really end her suffering? As night fell, the voice returned. "Remove your clothes and lie down." Ruth froze, tears streaming down her face. She didn't want to, but she had come too far to turn back. Her hands shook as she removed her dress. Finally, she lay on the mat, her body curled up in a pool of her own tears, and then she saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the hut. Ruth's breath hitched as the figure stepped into the flickering light. Her stomach turned, and she felt her scream clawing up her throat. It wasn't the handsome native doctor she had imagined. It wasn't even human. An old, hunchbacked dwarf with wrinkled skin and cruel, beady eyes stood before her. His grin revealed crooked yellow teeth, and his bony fingers stretched toward her. "Come, child," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping the ground. Ruth couldn't move at first, frozen in terror. But when his fingers brushed her arm, she let out a blood-curdling scream. Adrenaline surged through her veins, and she bolted from the hut, leaving behind her belongings. The forest seemed endless as she ran, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Branches scratched at her arms and face, but she didn't stop until she burst out onto the main road and saw her home in the distance. Ruth locked herself in her house for days, refusing to see anyone. She avoided mirrors, afraid she might see the spirit husband behind her. She stopped smiling, stopped dreaming of a life filled with love. Whenever boys approached her, she turned away, her voice cold and distant. "No," she would say before they could speak a word. At night, she curled up on her bed, clutching her pillow tightly. She couldn't escape the spirit husband who haunted her dreams, but she decided she would never return to that shrine. She had chosen her suffering over the terrifying hands of the ugly dwarf. And so, Ruth vowed to live alone, her heart locked away, forever caught in a battle she felt she could never win. It was a sunny afternoon. Ruth was coming out of a small grocery store. She carried a basket full of vegetables and bread. As she stepped onto the dusty road, a man with a bright smile walked up to her. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice warm like sunshine. "I couldn't help but notice how beautiful you are." Ruth's face hardened. She turned away quickly, muttering, "Please, leave me alone." But the man didn't give up. "My name is Larry," he continued, walking alongside her. "I'm not here to bother you. I just want to get to know you." Ruth stopped and faced him. "I said, leave me alone," she shouted, her voice echoing in the street. A few heads turned, and Larry stepped back, raising his hands. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to upset you." Ruth hurried off, her heart pounding. She didn't want to talk to him or anyone. She had her reasons. Deep down, she wished he would just disappear. But Larry didn't. He showed up at the same store the next day and the day after that. He didn't say much, just gave her a smile and nodded whenever she passed. One day, he brought her favorite snack and left it on her doorstep. Another time, he sent a little note that said, "I hope you're having a good day." Ruth rolled her eyes but secretly smiled when no one was watching. Months passed, and Larry's persistence began to wear her down. Ruth found herself thinking about him at night, wondering why he cared so much. She shook her head. "No, I can't let him in," she told herself. But no matter how hard she tried, Larry kept slipping into her thoughts. One evening, Larry came to visit her again. He brought a basket filled with gifts. Ruth peeked through her window, saw him standing there, and locked the door. "Go away," she shouted from inside. But Larry didn't leave. He sat down on her front steps. The sun sank below the horizon, and the night grew chilly, but Larry stayed. He hummed a tune and looked up at the stars. Finally, at midnight, Ruth thought he must have given up and left. She opened the door, and there he was, still sitting, his eyes heavy with sleep but full of determination. Ruth sighed. "You're crazy, you know that?" "Maybe," Larry said with a grin. "But I'm crazy about you." Ruth laughed despite herself. She stepped aside and let him in. For the first time, they talked, really talked. Larry tried to understand her, but Ruth didn't say much about her past. "I can't date you," she said firmly. "But we can be friends." Larry agreed, though his heart wanted more. Weeks turned into months, the two of them inseparable. They laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed quiet walks. But no matter how close they grew, Ruth always kept a wall around her heart. One day, Larry invited her to a cozy restaurant. They talked and laughed until Larry suddenly became serious. "Ruth," he said, reaching for her hand. "I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped a beat. "I want to marry you," he said. "I'm not here to play games or hurt you. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She pulled her hand away and stood up. "That's what they all say," she shouted. "I've heard those words before, and all they brought me was pain." Larry stood too, his face filled with concern. "Ruth, please," he said. "I'm not like them. Let me prove it to you." Ruth sat back down, tears streaming down her face. For a long time she said nothing. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to tell her story. She told Larry about the shrine, the rituals, and the spiritual bondage she had been trapped in for years. She explained why she avoided love, why she shut people out. Larry listened, his heart breaking with every word. When she was done, he took her hands in his and said, "Ruth, you don't have to face this alone anymore. I'll help you. With my money, my time, whatever it takes, I'll make sure you're free." Ruth stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But Larry's eyes were steady. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Absolutely," he said. "We'll go back to the shrine and fix this. Whatever it costs, we'll do it together." For the first time in years, Ruth felt a tiny spark of hope. Together, they began to plan their journey back to the place where her nightmares began. The day finally came. Ruth and Larry packed everything they needed and set off on the journey to the shrine. Larry walked beside her, holding her hand tightly. "We'll fix this, Ruth," he said softly, "no matter what it takes." When they reached the shrine, the place was eerily quiet. Ruth clung to Larry's arm. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It wasn't the usual assistant they had seen before. This time it was the chief priest himself, the dwarf. His face was wrinkled and menacing, and his eyes glowed like burning coals. He walked with a slow, deliberate limp, leaning on a crooked staff. "Who dares come to disturb the spirits?" The chief priest's voice rumbled like thunder. Larry stepped forward, his voice steady but respectful. "We've come to set Ruth free. I'm willing to give you anything you ask." The chief priest laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Anything, you say? Do you know what you're asking for, young man? You're meddling with powers far greater than you." Larry stood firm. "I don't care. Just tell me what it will take." The priest looked at Ruth, his gaze piercing. "She belongs to her spiritual husband. Breaking that bond is no small matter. He won't let go so easily." Ruth shivered, but said nothing, gripping Larry's hand tighter. After a long, tense silence, the priest finally spoke. "Very well. There is a way, but it comes at a price. You must appease her spiritual husband. He must agree to release her. For this, a great sacrifice is needed. 2 cows and 2 vultures." Larry didn't flinch. "Consider it done," he said. The priest raised an eyebrow. "You're quick to agree. The spirits will test your resolve. Bring the sacrifice in 3 market days, and we shall see if the spiritual husband will grant her freedom." Larry nodded. "We'll be back." With that, they left the shrine. That night, Ruth tried to sleep, but her mind was restless. She kept thinking about the shrine, about Larry's determination, and about her spiritual husband. As her eyes grew heavy, she drifted off, but what followed was no ordinary. It felt so real, as if she were awake and trapped in another world. She was lying on her bed when a presence filled the room. It was him, her spiritual husband, but this time it was different. "Show yourself," she cried out in the dream, tears streaming down her face. "I'm tired of being scared of you. I want to see you. I want to know who you are." The air grew still, and then he appeared. He was tall, dark, and breathtakingly handsome. His body was strong and chiseled, like a warrior carved from stone. His eyes glowed softly, full of mystery and longing. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and soothing. "I'm not here to hurt you, Ruth," he said, stepping closer. "I am your husband. I love you, and I have always protected you." Ruth's heart raced as he knelt beside her, his touch gentle but electrifying. His gaze held hers in a way no man ever had. "But if you love me," she said, her voice trembling, "why won't you let me be happy? Why won't you let me have a real life? I need a companion, a family. I want to build a life on earth. Please, if you truly love me, let me go." The spiritual husband's expression softened, but there was a shadow of sadness in his eyes. "No one," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "wants to share what they love. Ruth, I can give you everything you desire and more. Just stay with me, accept me." His touch sent shivers down her spine. He leaned in closer, and for a moment, Ruth felt a warmth and passion unlike anything she had ever known. Suddenly, Ruth woke up, gasping for air. Her room was dark and quiet, but her heart was racing. She sat up and touched her face, still damp with tears. And then she realized something else. She had enjoyed the dream far more than she wanted to admit. The memory of his touch, his voice, his presence lingered, leaving her torn. For the first time, she wondered, do I really want to go back to the shrine? As the days passed, Ruth couldn't stop thinking about the dream. The handsome figure from her hallucination haunted her thoughts. She found herself considering something unthinkable. What if she didn't go back for the sacrifice? What if she chose to stay bound to her spiritual husband? The struggle within her grew, and the clock ticked closer to the day they were supposed to return to the shrine. The 3rd day arrived, and it was time to return to the shrine. Ruth's heart felt like it would burst from her chest. Larry held her trembling hand as they walked along the dusty path. "Everything will be fine," Larry whispered, trying to reassure her. "We'll do this together." The shrine looked even more terrifying this time. Smoke rose from the ground, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. The chief priest emerged slowly, leaning on his crooked staff, his eyes glowing with the power of the spirits. "You have returned," he said in a deep, rumbling voice. "Are you ready to hear what the spirit husband demands?" Ruth clutched Larry's arm tighter. "Yes," Larry said firmly. "We're ready." The chief priest stared at them for a long moment before speaking. After consulting the spirit husband, he has made his demand clear. The only way to release Ruth is through a great sacrifice. He paused, letting the suspense hang thick in the air. "What is it?" Larry asked, his voice tense. "Just tell us. We'll do it." The chief priest's voice dropped even lower. "The man who wishes to marry Ruth must sacrifice his manhood. He will no longer be able to perform in bed, nor will he ever father children." The words hit like thunder. Larry shot up from his seat, his face red with anger. "What kind of sick demand is that?" he shouted. "Is he mad? Are you all insane?" Ruth's eyes widened in shock, and tears poured down her cheeks. "I told you, Larry," she cried. "I told you this wouldn't work. I'm doomed. I'll never be free." Larry took her hand. "Let's go," he said firmly, his voice trembling. They left the shrine in silence, the weight of the spirit's demand crushing them both. When Ruth got home, she collapsed onto her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her tears soaked her pillow as she picked up her phone to send Larry a message. "Larry, please move on with your life. It's clear I belong to the spirit. There's nothing we can do." She pressed send, her heart breaking into pieces. She cried for hours, feeling like all hope was lost. Larry, on the other hand, was no better. He sat in his car, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the message. He loved Ruth more than anything, but this was too much. Days passed, but Larry couldn't stay away. He missed Ruth more than words could express. One evening, he drove to her house and knocked on her door. When Ruth opened it, she was shocked to see him. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "Larry, what are you doing here? I told you to move on. This is our fate. Please, just go." Larry shook his head, his own tears falling. "I can't, Ruth. I can't leave you. I love you too much." She tried to push him away, but he grabbed her hands, holding them tightly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm going to do this for you. If sacrificing my manhood is what it takes, then so be it. We can adopt children in the future. All that matters is you. I mean it when I say I'll do anything for you." Ruth's mouth fell open, and she stared at him in disbelief. "You're joking, right? Larry, you can't do this. No, this is too much. It's not fair to you." Larry's grip tightened. "Ruth, you are my life. I've made my decision. I love you, and I won't let anything take you away from me." They stood there, crying in each other's arms for what felt like hours. Finally, Ruth gave a trembling nod. "If you're sure, if you're truly sure, then we'll do it." Weeks later, they returned to the shrine. The chief priest stood waiting, his staff in hand. "Have you come to make the sacrifice?" he asked, his voice echoing in the shrine. Larry stepped forward, his head held high. "Yes, I'm ready." The chief priest nodded and began the ritual. The cows were brought out, and the vultures circled overhead as the sacrifice was made. The sounds of chanting grew louder, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. As the ritual ended, the priest turned to Ruth and Larry. "The spirit husband has accepted your sacrifice. Ruth is free to live her life, but the bond is broken at a great cost." Larry looked at Ruth, his eyes filled with love. Ruth burst into tears, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for loving me this much." Larry smiled through his own tears. "You're worth it, Ruth." Ruth and Larry finally got married in a beautiful ceremony filled with laughter and joy. Ruth was glowing with happiness, and Larry couldn't stop smiling. After all they had been through, it felt like a fairy tale ending. That night, as they entered their cozy new home, both were nervous yet excited for their first night together as husband and wife. But things didn't go as expected. Larry was gentle and kind, but their first night together felt awkward. Ruth lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind drifting. She couldn't help but think about the strange feelings she used to have with her spirit husband. Her body felt disconnected, and though she didn't say it aloud, she missed the overwhelming sensations she had once experienced in her cursed dreams. Days turned into weeks, and Ruth pushed those thoughts aside. Their marriage was sweet at first. Larry showered her with love, and Ruth felt free from the torments of her past. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. But just when it seemed like their life was perfect, everything began to change. 2 years into the marriage, at first it was small things. Ruth would avoid Larry's touch, claiming she was too tired or busy. She stopped looking at him the same way she used to, and her smiles became fewer and far between. Larry noticed, but didn't want to upset her, so he kept quiet. Then one night, as Larry reached for her in bed, Ruth turned away with a loud sigh. "Ruth, is something wrong?" Larry asked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Larry, I'm tired. I'm not in the mood," Ruth replied flatly, pulling the blanket over her. Larry frowned. "Ruth, did I do something wrong? For 2 months now, you haven't let me touch you. What's going on?" "Larry, just let me be," Ruth said sharply. Frustrated, Larry sat up. "Ruth, please talk to me. I'm your husband. If something's wrong, we can fix it together." But Ruth's patience snapped. "What's the point, Larry? What's the point of letting you touch me when you can't even last more than a minute?" Her words cut through the air like a knife. Larry froze, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He stared at her, unable to speak, as tears welled up in his eyes. "Ruth, did you just say that to me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, Larry," Ruth said, sitting up in bed. I'm tired. I'm tired of this marriage. I can't keep doing this." Tears streamed down Larry's face, but Ruth's expression remained cold. She got out of bed, leaving him sitting there, broken and confused. Their once perfect love now felt like a fragile thread hanging by a moment, and neither of them knew if it could ever be mended.